Elysium IV was not a famous world. It was not the center of politics, trade, or war. It was a place where people went to heal, to start anew, and to raise families in peace. The colony's air was clear and gentle, its skies often painted with the hues of twin sunsets. Among the green hills and silver rivers stood an orphanage that had become a small beacon of hope for children who had lost their parents to disease, accidents, or the dangers of life in space. The building itself was simple but warm. Its classrooms were filled with laughter, its gardens echoed with play, and its halls carried the sound of children singing songs they had learned from teachers who cared deeply for them. Though life in the galaxy was rarely kind, Elysium IV had managed to create a corner where innocence could survive. That was why the moment of silence was so sudden, so unnatural, and so unforgettable. The attack came without warning. No declaration, no demand, no reason, only shadows in the sky. The colony's sensors screamed as ships appeared in orbit, foreign vessels with markings that few on the surface recognized. The alarm reached the ground, but it was too late. People looked up, expecting perhaps a flyover or a warning. Instead, they saw fire streaking downward. The orphanage was struck in the first wave. Windows shattered as the ground trembled, and a roar like thunder split the air. The children did not understand what was happening. One moment they were drawing pictures, and the next the sky itself seemed to fall upon them. Teachers rushed to shield them, pulling them close, but the building could not withstand the strike. The explosion was heard for kilometers. Those who survived in nearby towns watched in horror as smoke and fire rose where the orphanage once stood. Rescue crews ran into the flames, desperate to find survivors. They dug with bare hands when tools failed, calling out names, refusing to accept silence as an answer. Some children were pulled from the wreckage alive, clinging to their rescuers in fear and confusion. Many others were not. News spread faster than fire. Within hours, every settlement on Elysium IV knew the truth. Within a day, the entire human sphere of space had seen the images, the ruins of the orphanage, the toys scattered among broken stone, the soot-stained hands of rescue workers cradling children who had not lived to see another sunrise. At first there was grief. Families wept openly, strangers comforted each other, and communities held vigils beneath the stars. On every world, candles were lit, and silent processions marched through city streets. Humanity mourned as one. But grief did not remain grief, it transformed. Across colonies and homeworlds, people began to speak not only of sorrow but of resolve. Leaders who had long been divided stood side by side and declared their unity. Shipwrights who had once competed against each other now worked shoulder to shoulder. Soldiers who had retired decades earlier volunteered once more, driven not by duty but by something deeper, by the memory of lost innocence. It was not just a call to arms, it was a call to stand together. The galaxy, watching from afar, assumed humanity would protest and then fade back into silence. For centuries, humans had been seen as adaptable but fragmented, a people who endured hardship but rarely acted with one voice. This time was different. This time the wound cut too deep. In the halls of government, in the marketplaces of colonies, and in the quiet rooms of families, one promise echoed again and again. The children would be remembered, and those responsible would not be allowed to escape accountability. On Elysium IV, the ruins of the orphanage were not cleared away immediately. Instead, they were carefully preserved as a memorial. People came from distant towns and worlds to lay flowers and letters, drawings and handmade carvings. Messages written by children themselves covered the walls around the site, words simple yet powerful. We will not forget. The day the sky fell was not the end of hope. It was the beginning of something the galaxy had never seen before. Humanity had been wounded, but in that wound burned a fire of unity, of determination, and of quiet, unshakable resolve. What had been meant to break their spirit instead forged it into something stronger. And in the silence that followed the smoke, the galaxy felt a tremor, an unspoken warning that the story of Elysium IV was only the beginning. The news of Elysium IV did not fade with the turning of days. If anything, it grew louder. The images of the ruined orphanage, the silent rows of candles, and the children's drawings left at the memorial spread through every channel of communication. No human could look away. On colonies near and far, grief still hung heavy, but with it came something more powerful, a determination that humanity had not felt in generations. On Earth, the cradle of humanity, old rivalries fell silent. Leaders who had argued endlessly about trade, politics, or territory stood side by side before vast crowds. One after another, they spoke words that had not been heard in centuries: unity, duty, and resolve. For once, their voices were not met with doubt but with thunderous agreement. Humanity would stand as one. Across the colonies, the same spirit rose. On Mars, shipyards that had once produced freighters and mining vessels shifted overnight to the construction of warships. On Titan, engineers unveiled old schematics for defense platforms not seen since the earliest interstellar conflicts. On Luna, young cadets volunteered in record numbers, filling academies to overflowing. Even in remote settlements where the attack seemed far away, families contributed in the ways they could. Farmers donated harvests to feed soldiers. Technicians offered their skills to repair and refit aging starships. Children, too young to fight, wrote letters to the crews preparing to leave, reminding them why they marched to war. Everywhere the call was the same: for the children of Elysium. In orbit above the central human capital, the United Human Fleet began to form. Ships of every class and origin gathered: sleek naval cruisers, retrofitted freighters, converted exploration vessels, and the proud warships of old nations. Their hulls carried markings from dozens of worlds, but their crews flew a single banner, a banner marked with the symbol of the Orphanage. Among the captains, there was no hesitation. Many had lost nothing personally in the attack. Some had never even heard of Elysium IV before the tragedy. Yet when they stood on their bridges, watching their crews prepare, they felt the same quiet fire that had spread across the stars. This war was no longer about borders or resources. It was about memory, dignity, and the simple truth that some acts could not be ignored. The decision to act was not made in anger alone. Humanity knew the risks. The enemy was powerful, wealthy, and deeply entrenched. Many alien governments expected humanity to suffer heavy losses and retreat back into isolation. They whispered that this would be just another brief flare of resistance, soon extinguished. But those whispers overlooked something vital: the depth of human resilience when bound by a cause greater than survival. Old veterans returned from retirement, stepping onto ships they thought they had left behind forever. They carried scars from battles long past, yet when asked why they returned, their answer was always the same: for the children. Strategists gathered in command centers, planning campaigns with patience and precision. Scientists worked around the clock, unlocking forgotten technologies and reimagining civilian tools as weapons of defense. Communities raised funds, shared resources, and opened their homes to those displaced by the coming storm. The transformation was breathtaking. Humanity, long divided by distance and difference, had found in sorrow a unifying flame. It was not fueled by hatred, but by a promise that never again would the young be left unprotected, never again would the galaxy believe humanity would stand idle in the face of cruelty. From the smallest asteroid colony to the great cities of Earth, a single message echoed across the stars: humanity rises together. When the fleet finally launched, billions watched from every world. Families gathered around screens, citizens filled public squares, and children held candles as massive engines ignited. One by one, the ships of the United Human Fleet disappeared into the void, leaving streaks of light across the skies. Their departure was not mourned. It was celebrated, not because war was welcomed, but because courage had been chosen. The galaxy might not have understood it yet, but humanity had already crossed a threshold. They were no longer separate colonies, no longer fractured nations. They were one people, united not only by tragedy but by the strength to rise above it. And so the fleet carried with it more than weapons and crews. It carried the weight of a promise, the voices of billions, and the memory of the children who had been lost on Elysium IV. Wherever those ships went, the galaxy would see not just soldiers but a united humanity standing behind them. The call had been made. The answer had come. Humanity was on the move, and the stars themselves seemed to wait in silence for what would follow. The United Human Fleet did not wait long before proving its resolve. Once the ships had gathered and the crews sworn their oaths, orders rippled outward with a clarity rarely seen in human history. The enemy had struck without warning, but humanity would answer with precision. The first campaign was not one of grand battles or massive fleets clashing head-on. Humanity knew such a confrontation too early would risk everything. Instead, the opening strikes were surgical, swift, and devastatingly effective. The Varkesh Dominion, the ones who had attacked Elysium IV, controlled vast supply chains that stretched across hundreds of systems. They were known for relying heavily on predictable routes, fortified depots, and automated convoys. To the Varkesh, such stability was strength. To humanity, it was opportunity. Human scout ships slipped into enemy territory like shadows, their crews trained to operate with silence and patience. Using centuries of experience from both exploration and survival, they charted weak points in communication lines and mapped the heartbeat of Varkesh logistics. Every discovered pattern became a target. The first strike came at a fuel depot orbiting a barren moon. The Varkesh expected no trouble there. The station was protected only by automated drones and lightly armed patrols. In the dead of space, 3 human frigates emerged from the dark, their drives hidden by asteroid cover until the last possible moment. In less than an hour, the depot was reduced to drifting wreckage. The patrol never even managed to transmit a distress call. The second strike was even bolder. A convoy of cargo vessels, escorted by a pair of destroyers, traveled through what was considered secure territory. But human intelligence officers had intercepted communication schedules and knew exactly when the convoy would be most vulnerable. A single task force of corvettes ambushed them in an asteroid field, using the rocks for cover and confusion. The destroyers attempted to defend, but the humans fought with a ferocity and unpredictability the Varkesh had never faced. The convoy scattered, half destroyed, and the rest fleeing into deep space, their cargo abandoned. News of these raids spread quickly within the Dominion. At first, Varkesh commanders dismissed them as minor irritations. After all, what could a scattered species like humanity truly achieve? But irritation turned into unease as the attacks continued, each one more daring than the last. Supply lines weakened, fleets found themselves without fuel, and frontline troops went hungry as shipments failed to arrive. It was not just the destruction that unsettled the Dominion, it was the way humanity fought. They did not follow expected patterns. They did not retreat when outnumbered, nor did they press recklessly when holding an advantage. Instead, they adapted constantly, changing tactics mid-battle, using deception and creativity where the Varkesh relied on rigid structure. One battle in particular became legend even in those early days. A single human destroyer, outgunned 3-1, lured an enemy patrol into a nebula. Inside the cloud, sensors failed, visibility dropped, and confusion reigned. The human crew used signal decoys and drone relays to create the illusion of a full fleet. Believing themselves surrounded, the Varkesh ships panicked, firing wildly and even colliding with one another. When the destroyer finally slipped away, not a single human life had been lost, while the enemy had torn itself apart. The galaxy began to take notice. Reports of humanity's sudden ferocity reached neutral worlds, and whispers spread in marketplaces and councils. Some were astonished. Others were quietly impressed. More than a few began to wonder whether the Dominion had awakened something far more dangerous than they realized. Meanwhile, aboard the united human fleet, the mood was one of solemn determination rather than celebration. Victories were noted, but no one forgot the reason behind them. Crews painted small symbols of the Orphanage onto their ships, a reminder that each mission was not just about war but about memory. The raids were not for glory, they were for the children of Elysium IV. Commanders began to see a pattern emerging. With every successful strike, morale across human space surged higher. Colonies that had once feared isolation now felt pride, watching their fleets prove to the galaxy that humanity could fight and win. Volunteers continued to pour in, filling the ranks faster than ships could be built. The Varkesh Dominion had expected humanity to recoil, to beg for peace, or at the very least to hesitate. Instead, they discovered something new, a people who could take tragedy and transform it into unity, ingenuity, and unyielding strength. The first blows had been struck, small in scale, perhaps, compared to the vast wars of history, but large enough to send ripples through the stars. For the first time, the Dominion looked at humanity not as a minor species to be brushed aside, but as a storm-gathering strength. And in the silence after each battle, the crews of the united human fleet repeated the same words: "This is only the beginning." The Varkesh Dominion prided itself on power and order. Its fleets stretched across star systems, its laws imposed without question, and its enemies were usually crushed before they could even raise a defense. For centuries, the Dominion had believed itself unshakable. But now cracks had appeared, cracks caused not by another empire or coalition, but by humanity, a species the Dominion had once considered too scattered, too divided to pose any threat. The The raids on supply lines, the ambushes in hidden fields of rock, the precision strikes against depots, all of it was causing unease. What unsettled the Dominion most was not the losses themselves, but the speed with which humanity had shifted from mourning to coordinated resistance. And the galaxy was watching. Neutral systems, trade networks, and entire civilizations observed closely. Reports circulated not just of the raids, but of their symbolism. Ships of the United Human Fleet bore markings of the destroyed Orphanage, painted not in the style of intimidation, but as remembrance. Soldiers and pilots carried charms and tokens carved with the names of children lost on Elysium IV. Their cause was clear, and it resonated beyond their own species. In the Grand Council halls of neutral worlds, debates sparked. Some argued that humanity's response was reckless, that they risked being erased by the Dominion's overwhelming might. Others, however, saw something far more compelling, the strength of unity born not of conquest but of principle. To many, the human campaign was proof that even the smallest tragedy, if carried by enough hearts, could ignite a fire powerful enough to challenge empires. Merchants in distant starports began to whisper about human courage. Smugglers, once unwilling to risk angering the Dominion, now quietly offered supplies and intelligence to human ships. Entire species long oppressed by the Dominion listened to these tales with cautious hope. If humanity could resist, perhaps they too could find a way to break free. One such account spread farther than most. It told of a small human unit cornered on a barren moon, hopelessly outnumbered. Instead of surrendering, the soldiers set up decoys, transmitted false signals, and used their own transports as bait. Against all odds, they not only survived but turned the battle in their favor. The story became a symbol, a reminder that humanity's greatest weapon was not just their technology, but their unwillingness to yield when the odds demanded they should. Even those who had once dismissed humanity began to reconsider. An alien observer, a historian from a neutral civilization known for its careful records, wrote, "Humans do not fight like others. They do not calculate the balance of loss and gain as empires do. When their young are threatened, they fight with something that cannot be measured. They fight as though every battle carries the weight of their entire species." The Dominion, frustrated by these growing perceptions, responded with propaganda. They claimed the bombing of Elysium IV had been an accident, an unfortunate but unimportant event exaggerated by human emotion. They told the galaxy that humanity's resistance was doomed, that their fleets were but candles in the wind before a storm. But no amount of words could erase the images of human victories. No denials could change the fact that Dominion convoys were failing, that their fleets were being delayed, that their once fearsome reputation was now tarnished by hesitation. Within the United Human Fleet, the effect of this growing attention was tangible. Crews felt the weight of watching eyes, but rather than faltering, they stood taller. Every victory now carried double meaning. It weakened the Dominion, and it showed the galaxy that humanity would not be broken. Even when they faced losses, they carried themselves with resilience. On Elysium IV, the memorial at the Orphanage became a place of pilgrimage. Not only humans but visitors from other species came to leave tokens of sympathy. Flowers from alien worlds, gifts carved in strange designs, and letters written in unfamiliar scripts filled the site. The galaxy, though still hesitant, was beginning to align itself with humanity's story. For the first time, the Dominion felt something it had never experienced on such a scale: isolation. Its might had not diminished, but its certainty had. And in war, certainty often mattered as much as strength. The galaxy was watching. The galaxy was whispering. And the galaxy was beginning to believe that humanity was not just fighting for revenge, they were fighting for something larger. And in the quiet chambers of power across distant worlds, one question was asked again and again. If humanity can rise from grief to defy an empire, what else might they be capable of? The Dominion had underestimated humanity. What was meant to be a brief lesson, a single act of intimidation to remind the galaxy of Varkesh power, had ignited something entirely different. Humanity was not retreating. They were not pleading for compromise. They were advancing. As months passed, the United Human Fleet grew stronger, not weaker. Instead of dwindling under the weight of war, their numbers swelled as more ships were constructed, more volunteers enlisted, and more worlds committed their resources. Where once humanity had been a scattering of colonies with little coordination, now they moved as a single organism, each part working tirelessly toward the same goal. And with every passing week, the fleet became sharper. Engineers reactivated forgotten technologies hidden in archives, dusting off designs thought too ambitious for peacetime. At the shipyards orbiting Mars, massive hangars opened to reveal warships older than most of their crew members, ancient destroyers, cruisers, and carriers that had been mothballed generations ago. They were updated, refitted with modern systems, and reborn into service. This fleet, once thought to be relics of history, was now called the Leviathan Fleet. When the first Leviathan-class battleship left drydock, its engines glowing against the red horizon, crowds erupted in cheers. It was not just a ship. It was a declaration that humanity was prepared for war on a scale unseen in centuries. The Dominion, at first dismissive of the raids, began to take the human fleet seriously. Larger patrols were dispatched, supply routes rerouted, and fortified stations reinforced. Yet each time the Dominion adapted, humanity shifted again, turning obstacles into opportunities. One battle in the Helios Rift demonstrated this adaptability with stunning clarity. A Dominion armada of 20 warships was sent to crush what they believed to be a small human force. Instead, they found themselves lured into a carefully laid trap. Human ships darted in and out of dense asteroid fields, using hidden mines and improvised weapons to confuse and scatter the enemy formation. Dominion commanders, unused to such unpredictable tactics, overcommitted their forces. In the chaos, the Leviathan fleet arrived, its massive cannons firing in unison. By the time the battle ended, half the Dominion armada was destroyed and the rest limped away in disarray. Humanity had lost only 3 ships. The victory echoed across the galaxy. Neutral systems that had once doubted humanity's chances now began to reconsider. Small governments and independent colonies quietly sent aid, fuel, weapons, intelligence. Some even offered safe harbor for human ships. Humanity's struggle was no longer seen as a doomed rebellion, but as a fight that might actually succeed. The Dominion, however, could not afford to admit weakness. To their citizens, they proclaimed that the humans were nothing more than a temporary nuisance, destined to collapse. But within their war councils, tension was growing. For every fleet they dispatched, another was delayed elsewhere. For every system they tried to protect, another slipped from their grasp. The Varkesh leaders had expected compliance, yet what they faced was defiance more stubborn than they could have imagined. Among humanity, morale surged higher with each victory. Soldiers carried with them not just weapons but stories of survival, of clever escapes, of impossible odds turned into triumphs. Crews painted symbols of stars and flames beside the Orphanage emblem on their ships, each mark representing another battle where they had stood their ground. In the mess halls of distant outposts, young recruits listened wide-eyed as veterans recounted tales of daring ambushes and narrow escapes. The legacy of Elysium IV was no longer just tragedy. It had become a rallying cry. For humanity, every battle was personal. They fought not for territory, not for conquest, but for memory and protection. This truth resonated deeply, shaping their strategies and fueling their resolve. Even when outnumbered, they pressed on because every strike reminded the galaxy of why they fought. And so the tide began to turn. What had started as a desperate defense had become momentum. Humanity was not simply surviving, they were winning. Slowly, steadily, they pushed the Dominion back, reclaiming ground that had been lost and striking deeper into enemy territory. The galaxy, watching with growing anticipation, could sense the shift. Humanity, once overlooked and underestimated, was proving itself capable of feats no one had expected. Their ingenuity and resilience were no longer rumors but undeniable reality. In the command chambers of the Dominion, silence fell more often than before. Maps filled with markers of lost ships and disrupted convoys told a story that no speech could deny. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. And at the heart of that storm stood humanity, united, unyielding, and unstoppable. Humanity's momentum did not remain confined to raids and skirmishes. With the Leviathan fleet at its back and the united human fleet growing by the day, the campaign pushed deeper into Dominion-held territory. But with each world they touched, something unexpected began to happen. The conflict was no longer only about humanity. It was becoming something larger. The Dominion had ruled through fear for generations. Entire species lived under its authority, their cultures suppressed, their freedoms denied, their children raised under laws that stripped away choice. Many of these people had long since abandoned the dream of freedom. They had endured quietly and reluctantly, believing resistance to be impossible. Then they saw the humans. When human fleets liberated the mining colonies of the Orphanage belt, The enslaved workers expected another set of masters to arrive. Instead, they were stunned to find themselves given food, medical care, and the freedom to leave if they chose. When a garrison world in the Drenar system fell to a joint operation of the Leviathan fleet and local militias, humanity did not plant a flag. They restored power, dismantled the prison camps, and told the people they were free to govern themselves. These moments spread quickly, carried on waves of rumor and testimony. Whispers turned into stories and stories into hope. The humans, it seemed, were different. They fought fiercely, but not for conquest. They fought for something greater, justice, remembrance, and dignity, and that made others want to join them. Across Dominion space, voices rose. Small bands of rebels who had once struggled in isolation now reached out to the human fleet. Some offered intelligence, maps of hidden depots, codes to bypass defenses, names of collaborators. Others pledged their strength, bringing ships, soldiers, or resources to the cause. Slowly but surely, the fight against the Dominion was no longer a war waged by humanity alone. It was becoming a coalition of the willing, united by the spark of freedom. For the Dominion, this was a nightmare. They had thought humanity would be a lone enemy, a species they could crush in isolation. But humanity's example had lit a fire that could not be contained. Every attempt to stamp out the rebellion seemed only to fuel it further, as more oppressed worlds found courage in the stories of human victories. One such victory became a turning point. The Dominion fortress world of Kersh was infamous for its vast prison complexes. Generations of captives from dozens of species had been held there, forced to work in harsh conditions. When the united human fleet arrived, they fought a battle that lasted 3 days and 3 nights. The Leviathan-class battleships pounded orbital defenses while ground forces advanced with precision. Against all odds, the humans prevailed. When the prison gates finally opened, tens of thousands of captives stepped into the light. What followed was not a victory parade, but a moment of shared humanity. Survivors embraced their liberators, some weeping openly, others simply standing in stunned silence. Images of that moment spread farther and faster than any battle report. For many, it was the first time they had seen the Dominion's chains broken. For others, it was the proof they needed that humanity's cause was more than vengeance, it was hope. Back in human space, the effect was profound. Families who had once mourned in silence now spoke of pride. Children who had written letters to departing soldiers now wrote again, but this time with words of encouragement, knowing their parents and siblings were not just avenging Elysium IV, but changing the galaxy. The Dominion attempted counterattacks, desperate to regain control. But every strike was met with resistance not only from human fleets, but from the growing coalition that rallied to their side. Dominion commanders began to whisper of a widening war, one that stretched their fleets thin and left them unable to predict where the next blow would fall. Inside the councils of the united human fleet, leaders understood what was happening. What began as a cry for justice had become something greater, a movement to end oppression wherever it was found. The flame lit on Elysium IV had spread, growing brighter with every liberated world, every freed people, every ally gained. And yet, amid the momentum, the humans did not forget their original vow. On every ship, in every outpost, the symbol of the Orphanage remained. It was the reminder that this movement had not begun with power or ambition, but with loss, and with the promise that such a loss would never be ignored again. The widening flame was unstoppable. Humanity had lit it, but now countless others carried it forward. The Dominion, once feared as unbreakable, was finding itself cornered by not just fleets and armies, but by the power of unity, hope, and resolve. The war was no longer about a single tragedy. It was about the future of the galaxy itself. The campaign had spread across countless systems, but all roads now led to one destination, the Dominion's homeworld. The planet known as Varkesh Prime had been described for centuries as unassailable. Entire fleets guarded its approaches. Colossal orbital stations formed rings of steel and fire around it. Deep within its atmosphere pulsed a planetary shield that glowed like a sunlit ocean, its hum of energy audible even from orbit. No enemy had ever dared to threaten it, until now. For humanity and its allies, the war had always been about more than conquest. Each liberated world, each freed people had added to their coalition. Now, a vast fleet stretched across the void, drawn from dozens of species. At its core stood the united human fleet and the reborn Leviathan fleet, engines blazing, their hulls adorned with the emblem of the Orphanage that had ignited their struggle. When the order came, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The coalition leapt into hyperspace together, their vessels aligned for a single destination, Varkesh Prime. The Dominion expected fear. Instead, they were met with silence, an unshakable calm that radiated from every transmission. Humanity did not threaten or boast, they simply advanced. The first line of defenses opened fire immediately, filling the void with a storm of energy beams and missile salvos. But the coalition pressed forward, shields flaring bright, formations bending but never breaking. Fighters darted ahead in swarms, weaving through fire to strike at turrets and launch bays. Behind them, the Leviathan fleet fired as one, their colossal cannons unleashing waves of destruction that split apart Dominion cruisers like glass. The battle raged hour after hour. Dominion fleets surged in, confident their numbers would overwhelm. But humanity had never relied on numbers. They relied on creativity. Where the Dominion pushed forward in rigid formations, human commanders shifted constantly, feigning weakness, creating gaps, and striking when least expected. Their allies, long accustomed to the Dominion's oppression, adapted eagerly, discarding old fears in favor of newfound freedom. One strike force, led by a single human cruiser and a handful of allied corvettes, broke through an outer ring station by using its own power grid against it. Another unit lured Dominion reinforcements into an asteroid belt, then collapsed the belt with carefully planted charges, scattering rocks through the fleet and forcing a retreat. Slowly, impossibly, the impenetrable defenses began to fail. On the surface of Varkesh Prime, the Dominion leadership gathered in their citadel. Reports poured in, stations destroyed, fleets shattered, allies defecting. For the first time, their council chambers rang not with commands but with fear. Some urged negotiation, others demanded a final stand. But outside, the sky was already burning with the light of battle. At the height of the conflict, the coalition achieved the breakthrough. Human battleships struck in unison against the great planetary shield. Wave after wave of firepower hammered at the shimmering barrier until, with a thunderous crack that echoed through every comm channel, it collapsed. The capital city lay exposed. It was then the Dominion sent their transmission. Their voices trembled as they offered apologies, reparations, even surrender on humiliating terms. They spoke of peace, of compromise, of future cooperation. The reply did not come from admirals or leaders. It came from a single voice, a young captain whose ship had carried survivors from Elysium IV years earlier. Her message was simple, steady, and final. "We remember the children. Justice will be done." The advance resumed. Coalition ships descended into orbit, dismantling the last defensive grids. Human ground forces deployed alongside their allies, not as conquerors but as liberators, disarming garrisons and securing the capital. Resistance crumbled. By nightfall, the once mighty Dominion had lost what it had believed eternal. The battle did not end with cheers or celebrations. It ended with silence, a silence filled with the weight of memory. On every coalition ship, crews paused to honor the fallen, to remember why they had come. The war had never been about glory. It had always been about a promise born in sorrow, carried across the stars, and fulfilled in the heart of the enemy. Varkesh Prime had fallen. The Dominion's power was broken. The decisive hour had come, and humanity had shown that unity, resilience, and memory could do what the galaxy thought impossible. And in that quiet victory, a new truth settled across the stars. The age of the Dominion was over, and the age of humanity had begun. The fall of Varkesh Prime sent shockwaves across the galaxy. The Dominion, which had once stood as an unbreakable colossus, was gone. Its fleets lay scattered, its leaders taken into custody, and its homeworld freed from the weight of tyranny. For generations, people across the stars had lived in quiet submission. Now, for the first time, they looked up to the skies and saw possibility instead of chains. The coalition, forged in battle, did not dissolve in victory. Representatives from liberated worlds gathered alongside humanity to discuss what would come next. They met not in a grand hall of marble or under banners of conquest, but aboard a neutral station rebuilt from the ruins of war. It was there that the first words of a new charter were spoken, a promise to protect freedom, to resist oppression, and to stand united should such darkness rise again. Humanity did not claim dominion over this coalition. They did not plant their flag over the stars. Instead, they insisted on equality, that every voice, no matter how small, should be heard. To many, it was unthinkable. No victor in galactic history had ever chosen humility, yet this was humanity's gift, the refusal to become what they had fought against. Still, the scars of war ran deep. Entire planets bore the marks of bombardment. Families grieved for those who had not lived to see liberation. The coalition knew that the path ahead would not be simple. Peace required more than treaties. It required healing, trust, and vigilance. Humanity, tempered by tragedy, accepted this burden willingly. On Earth, monuments were raised, not to generals or admirals, but to the children of Elysium IV. In the heart of New Geneva stood the Garden of Remembrance, where every visitor could walk among living trees planted in memory of those lost. Names etched in stone lined its pathways, not just human names, but those of allies who had fallen in the struggle. The garden became a pilgrimage site, not for worship but for reflection, a reminder of the vow that had carried humanity across the stars. Among the coalition, humanity's reputation transformed. Once dismissed as a young, fragile species, they were now seen as the spark that had lit a fire no empire could extinguish. Other civilizations looked upon them not with fear, but with respect. Children on distant worlds studied the story of Elysium IV, not as a tale of vengeance, but as proof that courage could rise even from the deepest sorrow. For the veterans of the Leviathan fleet, peace felt strange. Their colossal ships, which had once thundered into battle, were now repurposed as guardians of trade routes and escorts for reconstruction convoys. The great cannons were quiet, their silence carrying more weight than any barrage. Some crew returned home, others chose to remain among the stars, but all carried with them the symbol of the Orphanage. It had become more than a mark of grief. It was a beacon, a promise to future generations. Even within the former dominion, seeds of change took root. Freed from their rulers' iron grip, ordinary Varkesh citizens began to shape their own destiny. Some feared reprisals, but humanity's example calmed their doubts. Instead of revenge, they saw justice tempered with mercy. Where once they had been instruments of an empire, they now had a chance to be something more. The galaxy moved forward, but the memory of how it had changed remained. Veterans told their children and grandchildren not just of battles fought, but of why they were fought. Teachers on distant colonies retold the story of the Orphanage, ensuring that its lesson would never fade. And in every corner of the coalition, from the smallest moon to the largest capital, the same vow was spoken in quiet moments: never again. In time, humanity returned to the rhythm of life. Cities bustled, families rebuilt, and explorers once more turned their eyes to uncharted stars. But beneath the progress lay a shared understanding, one that transcended borders and species. The galaxy had learned that even the smallest injustice, if ignored, could grow into something vast and terrible. And it had learned that the resolve of a single people, carried with unwavering conviction, could reshape the destiny of all. The war had begun with an act of cruelty that sought to silence the helpless. It ended with unity, remembrance, and the forging of a future where such cruelty would never be permitted again. Humanity had risen in fury, but more importantly, they had risen with purpose. And so, the legacy of the children of Elysium IV lived on, not only in the hearts of their own people, but in the fabric of the galaxy itself. The stars had been changed forever,